This is I Was 8. I'm Larry Fedoric, and this is my personal journal storytelling podcast. Be sure to find this podcast again next week, and be prepared. It's about the Boy Scouts. This week, a bit of a full circle story, starting when I was 8.
Season 4, Chapter 6, Diefenbaker.
I didn't follow the news that much when I was 8. At that age, who does? But this was a big story. This just in, Diefenbaker would be visiting our little town of Waukau, Saskatchewan in about 2 weeks. And now with the sports, here's Sporty Sporkinson. In the day, Diefenbaker was the Prime Minister of the entire country. He was our leader, Dief, the chief, and soon he would be in town in person. Wow, that is news! As a kid in Waukau, you didn't have to follow the news to know who Diefenbaker was. Diefenbaker was from Waukau. Well, even some basic research will tell you that the 13th Prime Minister of Canada was born in Ontario, lived in several places in Saskatchewan, and as a young lawyer for a short time had a small law practice in Waukau. Most of those facts be damned. We learned in school that Diefenbaker was from Waukau. His long-abandoned, tiny one-room law office still stood on the main drag between the hotel and the Ford dealership. It leaned precariously to the southeast, so much so that when grown-ups weren't looking, we kids would throw rocks at it to see if you could be the one who finally got it to topple over. Childhood political commentary aside, I think the Ford dealership still used the shed-like structure to store tires. Now, some of you may say that's a fitting enough tribute for Dief, but if not, you should know that eventually the structure was carefully moved down the street to the grounds of the Waukau Western Development Museum, where it was carefully restored inside and out to look like the law office it once was. The museum building itself, by the way, is actually my old grade school. Yeah, that's when you feel old, when you find out that the school you attended as a child is now a museum, including one room that has been curated to look exactly like one of the classrooms I was taught in. Stuff from your life, now relics of the past. I gotta sit down for a minute. It's my rheumatiz and arthritis. I know this because over a decade ago, I visited the museum. Quite the experience to walk into that building again, and then a classroom full of items you remember, desks, books, chalkboard, shackles, horsewhips, beating sticks. Okay, not those last ones. They must keep those elsewhere. I also saw the law office restoration, pretty cool. Even though they did a great job, you could still see a few dents in the outside wood, and I wondered if any of those were made by my rocks. I also knew of Diefenbaker because, believe it or not, my dad's side of the family used to love to talk politics at Sunday gatherings. Well, talk. More like yell, argue, fight. I absorbed a lot of political knowledge during those debates. For one thing, I was surprised how many people in politics were named Effin. There was the Effin Diefenbaker, Effin Douglas, Effin Thatcher, even Effin Pearson. And this was years even before Pierre Effin Trudeau. I also learned that when Diefenbaker was a young Waukau lawyer, he used to shoot pool with my grandfather, Metro Fedoric. I couldn't imagine Diefenbaker ever shooting pool, but that was the family legend. Later years, I wondered if any of Diefenbaker's political views or policies were formed after conversations with my grandfather. This is Metro Fedoric. He drinks too much, cheats at cribbage, shoots a mean game of 9-ball, and he is my top foreign policy advisor. It was he who helped me navigate the Cuban cigar crisis. There were a couple other ways I kept up with the news outside of the fedoric shouting matches. One was current events class in school. The now a museum school when it was still a school. Current events was twice a week and usually began our school day. Each of us had to go to the front of the class and recite some current event from the news without the aid of notes, cutouts, or props of any kind. I found it very stressful. The night before, I would beg Mom and Dad, "Tell me something from the news, please. I gotta have it for school tomorrow." "Okay, Russia? Yeah, okay, communists? Toilet paper. All right, not much, but I guess I gotta go with it." The current event usually came from Mom. Dad wasn't into the news that much, outside of screaming obscenities on Sundays. I remember riding with Dad in the car, and when the news came on, he'd shut off the radio and tell jokes.
Government officials insist that this an isolated incident.
"Hey, Larry, did you hear the one about the two guys in the desert?" Yes, I have, but I know that you will go ahead anyway. Two guys in the desert, one is carrying an umbrella, the other is carrying a car door. The guy with the car door says, "You're an idiot for carrying an umbrella. It never rains in the desert." "Oh yeah," the other guy says, "If I get too hot, I just open the umbrella and I have shade." "You're the idiot for carrying a car door." "Oh yeah," the other guy says, "If it gets too hot, I just roll down the window." Bah! Good one, Dad. Still funny after 37 times. That was actually one of my dad's favorite jokes, by the way, and I've really come to love it over the years. But for current events, yeah, so these two guys were in the desert? Hardly. I did prepare for current events class, as I said. My idiot friend Philip, on the other hand, told his story about a ship on the ocean that sank, and though many people survived, also many died. After about the fourth time he told the story, Mr. Hackman pointed out in front of everybody that the Andrea Doria incident happened many years ago and didn't qualify as a current event, Philip. Larry, you're next. My story today is breaking news. Guess who is coming to town? The Prime Minister of Canada, Effin' Diefenbaker. Okay, Larry, sit down. Class over. We're going to move on to arithmetic now. The Diefenbaker visit was also front-page news in our local paper, the Waukah Recorder, a weekly delivered to our house. Mostly local news, and despite not having a comics section, I read it. Felt grown up to read the paper. I always looked for people's names that I knew. One time my dad's name was part of the front page story. Though only early March, Dad had spotted a robin in town and phoned it in as a hot news tip. The story caused quite the buzz about the possibilities of an early spring. That copy of the Recorder was between two pieces of wax paper and inside a scrapbook locked in a trunk upstairs. I mentioned that Diefenbaker was originally from Ontario, and we all thought of him as from Waukah, but to me, part of the excitement was that he was actually from TV. Seeing someone in person who was from TV was pretty spectacular, almost surreal. I will point out that the great Saskatchewan country music duo of Ernie and Sylvia didn't really count. They played our town a couple of times, and then later I saw them again on TV. But I had already seen them in person first. You get the difference? When you only see someone on TV and then you see them in person, it's a whole different animal, right? Remember my story of hypnotist Ravine? He came to town as the man from TV. And now another great hypnotist, Dief the Chief, I would see in person. I wonder if he would also make anyone cluck like a chicken. Diefenbaker Day finally arrived. A wonderfully sunny, bright, hot prairie summer day. But I had to wear a tie. All the men wore ties. Diefenbaker was announcing some funding for our hospital, I think, and that's where the crowd gathered in the big yard between the hospital and the Roman Catholic Church. Eventually, the doctor came out with F&G Diefenbaker and addressed the crowd. I have no idea what he said. I was just enamored of the man from TV. Oddly, except for the red brick of the hospital wall, I remember the whole thing in black and white. Maybe it was his white hair, gray suit, black tie. He talked a bit, people clapped, and then we went home. Earlier, I had asked my grandfather if he and Effin were going to shoot a game of pool. He said no, and Grandfather didn't even show up that day to reconnect with his old buddy. The next time I saw Effin speak again, he was back on TV. We continued to learn about the Prime Minister and government in school. Turns out his name was John George Diefenbaker, and his wife was named Olive. She was once a school teacher, just like my mom. The Diefenbakers had no children, but raised a daughter from Olive's previous marriage. Ooh, how scandalous. My education also continued at the Fedoric get-togethers, where I learned that Diefenbaker, Pearson, Douglas, and actually every politician who had ever held office at any level of government had no idea what they were doing. They were all idiots. I guess smart people don't run for office. I am going to mention that at current events. Decades later, and only a few years ago, I was befriended by and met a man named George Dryden. Do you remember this name? George contacted me because I was in the media, and George was trying to get his story out there. George and I talked many times, both on and off the air. George Dryden's claim was that his real father was John Diefenbaker, the one and the same John George Effin Diefenbaker. The resemblance was obvious. George teased about it most of his adult life, but he also had other evidence. In 2011, when George was 42, he discovered that the man who had raised him was not his biological father. The Drydens were a prominent and wealthy family. George's mother had always been a close friend of John Diefenbaker, and when George found out that Gordon Dryden was not his real father, he put two and two together. George did many media appearances outside of my show. He was on national television and newspaper pleading his case. All he wanted was some Dief family DNA and what he felt would be evidential acknowledgement that our 13th Prime Minister was his real dad. The more public he went, the more he was cut out of the Dryden family and fortune. George spent all of the money he had, and whatever else he could borrow or cajole from others, on his own investigation. He visited the Diefenbaker Museum in Saskatchewan, incidentally not the little law office in my town, to see if an old hairbrush might contain some DNA. He parked outside Diefenbaker family homes in Ontario, hoping to steal some tissue from the trash, all to no avail. Not enough DNA evidence there. All Diefenbaker descendants blocked him at every turn. On air or just on the phone from home or even Sunday brunches, I heard from George of his continuing efforts. I told him of my childhood connections, such that they were. George was dubbed Diefenbaby by most of the media, not me, and eventually insisted on being called George Diefenbaker. I believed George's story. Still do. Every time George and I communicated, my mind would wander back to the day when I was so excited that the man from TV was in my hometown. If you think that I could barely picture Effin Diefenbaker shooting pool, I certainly could not picture him having sex. But my personal belief is that sometime shortly after he visited my town, that's exactly what he did. Not with Olive, but with his close friend, Mary Lou Dryden. I was always surprised that someone didn't just bankroll George's cause, not to sully the Diefenbaker name or whatever the family was so afraid of, but to give a man his birthright. 5 years after George first discovered the paternal news, he lost the life battle, passing at age 47, body riddled with disease, broke, and frustrated. He just stopped. The search for the truth seems to have died with him. If I ever do get back to my hometown again, I'll visit my old school, now a museum, and then go stand outside the Diefenbaker law office and throw some rocks at it. For George.
I Was 8 is a weekly storytelling podcast written, produced, and voiced by Larry Fedoruk. A new episode every Thursday on all major platforms or Larry's I Was 8 YouTube channel. Tell a friend about his podcast and reach out to Larry Fedoruk, that's Fedoruk, at LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com.